It's a rainy, thunderstormy, cloudy, boo-boo day in Chicago. And I tend to get very introspective and dive inward when the weather is not cute. So I really wanted to embrace today's tone to help me just dive into this conversation further, to really get into the vibes of today. So first and foremost, I am just a dude on the internet that is talking about things that they've experienced and sharing them with people that are also on the internet and that have also experienced things. So very, very low stakes, very low key, chill vibes. But yeah, if in any way, shape, or form that adds more credibility or validity to myself and what I'm about to spit right now, then keep watching / listening because I'm a certified yapper and low-key philosopher. Yeah, so today I want to talk about what my process of diving inward for myself looks like, what tools I use to help me take stock of where I've been, where I'm at, and where I want to go. Because I feel like that process is a process that is just never ending, constant, just as a human being on this planet. Especially now, I think the age that we're living in, the digital age that we're living in, it's very easy to lose track because it's just very things are just constantly moving. We're constantly bombarded with so much information. We're constantly overstimulated. At least for me, living in America, it's a hyperproductive country where rest isn't really promoted because you kind of can't rest to keep up with everybody. So for me, protecting that process of reflecting, slowing down, grounding myself to see myself clearly, to see my future clearly is really sacred. And I just want to share more about that and also give y'all some of my little nifty tools. But yes, let's dive into where I'm at now and where I came from. So last month marked 2 years since I moved to Chicago by myself. That whole process was a really long one, a really stressful one, because I wasn't really supported by anybody in my life. I feel like as soon as I started asserting that dream out into the world, just my inner circle, my family, friends, didn't really understand where that was coming from. But because my relationship with myself, my protection of my dream and my protection of that process of reflecting and grounding myself in my desires was so strong, I didn't let that get in the way or really put too much doubt in me to the point where I was no, I'm not going to do it. I already had this routine, this habit of self-reflecting, of checking in, of constantly recalibrating and readjusting to see if where I was heading was actually where I wanted to be heading. I didn't really let those doubts get in my head, especially when I noticed that people weren't doing that for themselves. No tea, no shade, but people are always going to opinionate and speak on you and your life and what you should, maybe do. And you shouldn't take that advice if that person isn't actively doing that in their life. There was no shortage of people who were telling me that what I was doing or that what I was about to do wasn't going to pan out. And it wasn't they were explicitly telling me you're not, you can't do that or you shouldn't try to do that. It was more so in the questions that they would ask me. And again, me observing how they lived their life. Things like, you haven't found a job. How are you going to do that if you only have this much amount of money saved up? Or what are you going to do if this random thing happens? Or just a lot of what ifs, a lot of things that are valid questions. It is good to to prepare. It's good to prepare and to take into account things that may or may not happen. But I think that sometimes can be the thing that is blocking you from actually trying the thing, is the fear itself. Again, I would notice the habits and the behaviors, just playing it small and seeing how somebody wasn't necessarily happy in their life, seeing somebody complain about how much they hated their job, but they weren't actively working towards something else that would be more fulfilling, or hearing somebody talk about how they really wanted to try this thing, but there was always this excuse. There was always XYZ, all these things that were keeping them from trying. And it comes back to the lack of self-reflection, the lack of accountability, because I think that if you're willing to go into yourself and acknowledge the things that you've been doing that aren't necessarily helping you, then you're already like miles ahead from everybody who's just like jumping from one thing to another, distracting themselves, because the pain around acknowledging where you're at right now and how far you might be from that thing is like too great for a lot of people. I think we live in a world that unfortunately doesn't equip us with the ability to transmute pain, with the ability to look at not only our individual pain, but also collective pain. It's a very painful process, I feel like, the process of changing, of shifting. When I think of old versions of me, I think of what that person looked like in the world. I can see how me 5 years ago used to dress, of how I used to talk. And the person that I am now is very different. There is a secondhand embarrassment that comes with looking at that past version of myself. It feels very vulnerable to show people like that's who I used to be. That's what I used to look like, because there's a lot that's changed since then. You know, there's a lot of maybe losses that have happened, grieving that's happened, mistakes that were made, tough lessons that had to be learned. That's why I think it's important to talk about it. It's a big part of what even enables human growth, right? Is our ability to look back on tragedies, on mistakes, and analyze that, and then decide for ourselves what we want to do about it, so that moving forward, we can maybe avoid the same mistakes that the people before us made, or that we ourselves made. Like, for example, something that I think a lot about is colonization. And I feel like that's one of the biggest ones that humanity is just like not willing to look at. Where we're at right now, the trajectory of like taking accountability for colonization is a very interesting one to observe. You know, we hear talk about movements like Land Back, and we also see the colonization of Palestine by Israel. And we see the like terrible, disgusting repercussions of that. But it's like we're living through it right now. We're trying to figure out how to mend that, how to, you know, have a people take accountability for their atrocities. And I think about how we're even just dealing with the aftermath of the colonization of different peoples. Like for me, I think about the colonization of Mexico, because that is very near to me. I'm a Mexican American, and I think about my dad, whose family is indigenous to Mexico and who grew up speaking Nahuatl. You know, through the process of colonization of Mexico, there was that disconnect in that identity. I see the way that my dad shamed himself into not sharing that language with me, because that wasn't like the dominant language. Like the dominant culture was very much like Spanish, Spanish, Spanish. And that's not native to Mexico, right? That's native. That's Spanish people's culture that they brought to Mexico, and they forced the indigenous people to take on. And for me, that's where I feel like a big piece was missing. And the older that I get, the more that I desire this really deep connection to myself and where I've been, where my people have been. And I just think about, you know, in the future, my kids and their kids, how they might feel. And so for me, it's important that I talk about that. It's important that I honor my ancestors, the people that came before me, and I acknowledge them and their importance in my life, in where I'm at now. Because if it wasn't for those people, I wouldn't be here right now. I wouldn't have the privilege of sitting here in my own apartment and to actually have a plethora of tools at my disposal to create a life that I'm fully satisfied with. So the process of reflection and turning inward is like, I think, understated conversation. I think that at large, like, it isn't a skill that is being taught to us. I have a lot of issues with the public school system, because the public school system basically just teaches you how to take in information, how to memorize it, and then regurgitate it back. It doesn't teach you how to think critically. It doesn't teach you how to process your feelings and like how to actually live your life, how to actually like engage in your life in a way that is healthy and like meaningful to you. But that's a whole other topic. We don't need to go into that right now. But with that said, with talking about the importance of reflection, of turning inward, of like knowing yourself through the process of analyzing your past, the past of maybe your ancestors. I want to talk more about some of the things that I really personally like to do to keep building on that skill, to keep building on my, I guess, efficiency with self-reflecting, because I feel like the more that you're able to stay in alignment with yourself, where you're at right now and like where you want to be in your experience, in your accomplishments, whatever, it just feels easier and easier over time to actually get there, right? Because at first it might feel clunky. At first it might feel really uncomfortable to just sit and like process your feelings, because like, again, that's not something that we're really taught. The one that has just like carried me through my life has been writing. I've been writing from as early as I can remember. I've always been somebody that just like processes a lot of information and has a hard time making sense of it if I don't brain dump it somewhere. And so being able to put that information somewhere and then, let it live and then coming back to it later gives you like a different level of understanding about yourself, because you're really able to like, it might be uncomfortable to look at where you were maybe like 2 weeks ago. Maybe 2 weeks ago you were spiraling and struggling to make sense of life. And then, time passes, life's, you go about it. And then you come back to it. And then maybe things have changed. Maybe somebody did something for you that was really nice, or you had a great conversation with somebody and it really shifted your perspective on things. And then you come back to that piece of yourself and you're like, hey, that's how I felt at one point in time. And this is how I feel now. It makes you aware of just like the ever shifting nature of things. And it's a constant reminder that things really are not permanent. Things are extremely temporary. And it's important to, be grateful for the moments that you do have. So I think that just writing on its own, super good for your mental health, super good, not just like refining your ability to like grow and shift through change, but also like that resilience, because it's just constantly like affirming that things are literally going to get better. Things do get better. And if things aren't getting better, it at least makes you aware of the process. It makes you aware of like your habits and your thought patterns, right? Like if you're constantly writing that you feel like shit and that you hate your job, if it eventually gets to a point where it's like, okay, bro, what are we going to do about it though? Because nobody's coming to save you, is what I realized. I've definitely been stuck in cycles of like helplessness, because it does feel nice sometimes to like dwell in that pain and have that pity party for yourself. But, eventually you reach a point where you're like, I've had enough. That's enough. We got out of our system. That's enough. Time is passing. It's been like 3 years since I keep writing about the same shit. What are we going to do about it? What needs to change? So it's a really good reality checker. Love writing, love journaling. I try to journal most mornings. I try to do that for at least 10 minutes. But I know that sometimes even just doing that is like a big commitment for a lot of people. I feel like sometimes just that task alone on top of other tasks that you have to deal with, like on the day-to-day, like I get it. There'll be times where I go weeks, months without journaling because life gets crazy. Life is hectic, Adulthood is not easy. So if that is a bit much, something that I also like to do is just like recording voice memos. So if you have a phone, you likely have access to the voice memos app, or just like any sort of like recording app. I know that there are also, for me, last fall, I was struggling a lot. So like I was having a really hard time just like sitting down and writing, because there was just like a lot of really shitty things happening in my life. And there was honestly just an unwillingness to sit down and accept that those were the things that were happening, because then I knew that I would have to do something about the things that I wasn't satisfied about. So I wasn't writing. What I was doing was really just like waking up and talking to myself. I was recording voice memos because I knew that me months later was going to hear those back, and I knew that things were going to change. But sometimes I need that. Sometimes I need to let myself dwell, and I need to just like pour the pain out into something. And for me, that was just voice memos. And one of the voice memos that I actually recorded back in January was actually the inspiration for today's episode, because so much changed just through that process of recording my voice memos for a few months. I'd wake up and I'd talk to myself and I thought, this kind of dumb. Like, I'm wasting like 30 minutes. Like, what am I really getting out of this? Like, I could be doing like all these other things. But through the process of sitting down with myself and like acknowledging where the pain was, I was giving myself an opportunity to really create from that pain, like to actually transmute the pain instead of burying it inside of myself. So I remember talking a lot about wanting to birth creative projects, about wanting to travel more, about potentially moving to a new state. And it felt like so fantasy, basically. It felt like I was at such a low point that it felt like I actually was just like speaking like nonsense. But because I was constantly talking about the same thing, I was waking up and I was talking about the same thing, I was processing the same things, it was forcing me to low-key do something about it. Even though I felt like I wasn't doing anything about it, I started having conversations with friends about the things, I started talking to family members about the things, and then it inspired me to actually do the things because I felt like I kept hitting a wall where it was like, I'm not going to see anything different, I'm not going to feel anything different until I actually do something different. And so talking about that, I also think it's really helpful to take a lot of videos and a lot of pictures about anything, about your life. I would sometimes do voice memos and I sometimes would just record videos of myself talking, or I'd record like little vlogs. A lot of these like mini vlogs or like little like photo shoot sessions were just for me, to look back on and like feel grace and also gratitude for that version of me that was still trying to nurture myself and love myself despite how shitty I was feeling about everything else that was happening in my life. That is an act of love, to let yourself take up space, even if it doesn't look pretty, even if it doesn't feel presentable. That's you, and you're worthy of love. You're worthy of all of the things that you're yearning for. I think that all these things are just great tools because it doesn't make sense to like keep them insulated inside of ourselves. By creating with it, by recording those things, we're basically releasing it from our mind, from our body, from our spirit, if you will. And we're like putting it out into the world, and we're letting the universe transmute that energy through that process. It's a very human process, we see that echoed in the way that our earliest ancestors were like literally painting on cave walls. It's a very human thing to want to record, to want to leave our mark in some way, shape, or form, and to use that as a tool to learn, to use that as a tool to evolve. But yeah, that was pretty much it for this episode. I honestly, I had written a script before this, but upon self-reflecting, I was thinking about how I tend to overthink the things that I create, and I tend to lose that very important process of being in flow by like taking myself out of the process. You know what I mean? By like creating a script and then like looking at the script constantly. It's not really coming from a place of like genuine being in that moment. It's coming from like, oh, I have this like perfect script and like I'm going to hit point A, then I'm going to hit point B, and it's going to flow perfectly into point C. And then I'm going to have like this piece of research and like this interesting article to like point to. So that really just wasn't the vibe for today's episode. Like I said, I woke up, it was thundering outside, it was a little gloomy, and that weather was just hitting. So it was like, I just want to be cozy and I just want to just speak from that place, just being in the present moment and like slowing down to just be grateful for how far I've come and not put that much pressure on like what I'm putting out into the world. And so if that's something that you're struggling with, if that's something that you needed to hear, also take it from me, like there's always going to be pressure. There's no shortage of pressure and criticism and like negative feelings out in the world. There's definitely a need for more grace, a need for more vulnerability. So take some time to sit with yourself, to be vulnerable with yourself. That's where a lot of the growth happens. Even if it's embarrassing, even if it's awkward, is really worth it. That's it for today's episode. And I hope that y'all have a good rest of your week. I'll see y'all in the next one.